You might remember I've explained before that Matthew's Gospel is divided from the beginning and the end. We have those sections there, and in between that we have 5 sections which we traditionally call books, and each book has the same kind of pattern, starting with a narrative section telling us about what Jesus did and so on, and then we have a discourse section, a teaching section. So these 5 books then mirror for us the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Torah, which we traditionally ascribe to Moses. And this is one of the little keys to understanding Matthew's Gospel, is that Jesus, he presents us, is the new Moses, the new lawgiver, and the new one who leads us out of the slavery to sin and into new life. Now, we've just finished chapter 13, and reading chapter 13, and now we've come on to a new section, the 4th section in Matthew's Gospel, and this really deals with the church, really Jesus' teaching and miracles and so on that are somehow connected with the church he was going to establish. So it started off at the very end of chapter 13 when Jesus is rejected in his own town, in Nazareth, and then he starts his journeying towards Jerusalem. And then at the beginning of chapter 14, we have the account of the beheading of John the Baptist. So here we've got sort of 2 rejections. The rejection of Jesus by his own people and the rejection of John the Baptist by Herod, having him beheaded at the bequest of his daughter, or his wife's daughter, Salome. And then we get onto this passage here, which was why at the beginning of the bit that I've just read, it tells us that when Jesus received the news about John the Baptist's death. So here we've got this passage about the multiplication of the loaves. This section continues, it's quite a long section. So it goes through various miracle stories and the second multiplication of the loaves for the 4,000 people. And then it gets to the very important part of Matthew's Gospel and the important part of this section, which is Peter's proclamation of faith, that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah, the one who was to come into the world. And Jesus tells Peter he's blessed because of this, and he will give Peter the keys of his church. So he's going to make him the head of his church. And then we have a prophecy of the Passion and the Transfiguration of Jesus, and then another prophecy of the Passion. And then we get onto the narrative section. So it's quite a lengthy section, really, mostly about miracles, but then very importantly getting on to a declaration of who Jesus is and that Peter will be the head of the church. So our little passage here of the multiplication of the loaves sits within this context. And it's really important when we see various little words that ring bells for us, that this is in the context of the narrative about the church, and this is Eucharistic. So Jesus raised his eyes to heaven. He took bread as well as fish, and fish, of course, was the early an acronym for Jesus Christ, Saviour of the world. So it's all reminders about that Jesus is the true loaf, the true bread. And lifting his eyes to heaven, as he did at the Last Supper with the loaf of bread, and blessed it, and then broke it, and gave it. All these words are key words to help us to understand that the Eucharist is at the heart of the life of the church. So that's why this miracle is so important. It features in all 4 Gospels. And in fact, John adds on to it the Eucharistic discourse. That's part of chapter 6 in John's Gospel. So here, Matthew, just the mere words and its position in the context of a discourse, a narrative section about the church, is really important. It gives us its situation. So what happens here is that Jesus tries to find, in this translation, it's called a lonely place. It's actually eremos, which is where we get eremitics from. So desert, it's a desert place. And a desert, context of Moses, Jesus, the new Moses, reminds us of the wandering through the wilderness, doesn't it? So remember when the Hebrew slaves were rescued by God through the hand of Moses and escaped going through the Red Sea and into the desert, the wilderness, and there wandered there for 40 years. And who fed them? They were grumbling because they were hungry, and God fed them with manna in the desert. So this is another allusion to Jesus being the new Moses who set his people free, but the new Moses who will feed his people. Also, he healed them. And remember in Numbers 21, when the people were grumbling and they got bitten by the snakes, and then the Lord commanded Moses to make a brazen serpent in bronze, and those who looked upon it were healed, and so they didn't die. So there's again another little reminder of Jesus being the new Moses who sets us free from sin. So this lovely picture here, we've got the people see or get word of that Jesus has got into a boat alone to go off to some lonely place to pray, and they guess where he's going to go, so they drop everything and run after him. That's obvious that they dropped everything because they didn't bring sandwiches and so on. They didn't bring their pork pie and all that kind of stuff I would have brought, because they had to leave in haste. Because they thought, right, he's going, come on, right, drop everything, run after him. Hence, they're hungry at the end of the day. So that's why the disciples say, send them off to the villages round about so they can buy something to eat. It's getting dark and so on, getting late. So here we've got this lovely image of really drop everything, which we need to do as well, and go and run after Jesus to find him. And we need to be hungry for him. So then we come into this lovely bit towards the end. And they all had as much as they wanted, and they collected the scraps remaining. Well, the remaining scraps, the word that's used is an adjective, and it has the same root for the word for abound, perisuo, so I abound. And that's really important in the early church, especially for Paul. When we read Paul's writings, God's grace abounds. There's a superabundance of God's grace. We only need to ask him, and he wants to give it to us. And this is really the focus, one of the focal points of this story, is that the superabundance of God's grace, because there were the 12 scraps, 12 baskets fulls of scraps, one for each disciple to collect, of all these scraps remaining. And it's not because they were wasted, it's because God's grace is there for the asking. And he says the same thing to us. You know, it's superabundant, that wonderful word that Paul keeps using, how much grace abounds. Sin abounded, but grace abounded even more, and so on. And this is an echo of that idea in the very early church, that God's grace abounded. And here he said he fed 5,000 men, to say nothing of the women and children. I don't think they went round counting everybody or one of those little clicker things. But what was so important, there was such a large crowd that it was a miracle. And they're absolutely gobsmacked at the wonderful grace and what Jesus could do. So we ask God to come into our lives today as well, with this superabundance of grace, and recognizing him as the new Moses who sets us free from sin and gives us new life